There's no one definition of what leadership is. You have to understand what it is that the challenge that you face requires. Sometimes it's going to require that spirited combativeness of a Teddy Roosevelt. Sometimes it's going to require that patience and that willingness to fail that Abraham Lincoln had. And FDR had that confident, optimistic style of leadership that was perfect for ensuring trust and hope in the American people at a time when they needed it. Well, Roosevelt was the center of the little estate on which he lived. His life was insulated with other wealthy families. The Roosevelt money had been made years before, so he never saw the upward climb of his family. He just saw the money there. He was on a path toward a more conservative lifestyle like his father had led to become the head of the estate. He went to Harvard, and then he went to Columbia Law School, and then he went to a law firm. And there's a moment when he's 28 years old and the Democratic Party came to him and asked him to run for the state legislature, not so much because they saw something in him, but rather they knew that the name would help, the Roosevelt name, and they knew that his mother had the money to help back the campaign. But he said, yes, I'd love to do it immediately, which showed there was something inside of him. And the minute he got out on the campaign trail, he found his voice. He became a politician by instinct, by pleasure. He loved it. He loved it from that day until the day he died. When he was in the state legislature, Woodrow Wilson took notice of him. And then when Wilson became president, he picked him to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he really prepared us for World War II because he saw ahead of time what might be coming in Europe. And then the world seemed to come to an end for him. He goes swimming one day in perfect health, and he goes up to bed, and he is paralyzed from the waist down from that night on. But he brought himself back from that brink, and there's no question that that experience changed him. It really made him emerge more warm-hearted than he'd been before, with a deeper sense of confidence than the cockiness that sometimes had been part of him earlier in life. So then he was asked by Al Smith to run for governor, and at first he hesitated because he had still not been able to walk on his own, and it was a very scary thing for him. He wasn't sure he'd be able to make it, but in 1928 he did make it to the governorship.
October 1929. After the most spectacular rise in its history, the stock market crashes.
When the Depression hit, he saw that local governments and individual contributions and charity were not able to deal with the problem of unemployment and people's need for food. So he changed the way the government in New York dealt with the people. He made government as a duty, not as a charity. He took the lead of all the states in responding to the Depression in a way that the Republican president, Herbert Hoover, was not doing. So he became then even more of a national figure and the natural candidate for the Democratic Party.
I am glad of this opportunity to extend my deep appreciation to the electorate of this country. This clear mandate shall not be forgotten.
Between the election and the inauguration, the economy got worse and worse. Thousands of banks collapsed, there were riots in the streets, and it seemed like the whole economic system was just dying right then. Roosevelt was so worried about the economic situation that he feared that the House of Cards might collapse before he even had the chance to take the inauguration. The first thing he did on assuming office was to give an inaugural that gave hope to the American people.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
But then he announced, almost the very next day, a bank holiday, very euphemistically named, which meant all the banks in the country were going to be closed for a week while he could figure out what to do. And he had to get legislation through the Congress to shore up the weaker banks, get federal money to be actually flown to those banks, and then which banks already had enough assets to open on their own, and which banks would probably be closed and go away, and you'd have to help the depositors. And he got that bill through the Congress within hours on one day, and then the following Monday they were going to open again. But even then they weren't sure what would happen. The people now had access to their money again. Would they come running to take it out? There were huge lines that day, but instead they were coming to bring their money back to the bank. If they hadn't been able to stabilize the banks, it's hard to imagine that anything else could have taken place. But then once the banks were stabilized, Roosevelt realized, okay, the patient is not critical anymore, but now we have to figure out why did the patient get so sick. Once he started to talk about systemic reform, then he got into lots of opposition. In fact, the business community would say, we're done now. The banks are okay. We're stabilizing, so let's just go on like we were before. But he knew that that wasn't going to work. A lot of his bills were challenged on an unconstitutional assumption of power on the part of the federal government, but he was able to get people jobs in ways that nobody had been able to do before. He was able to regulate the stock market, and the SEC came about, and he changed the way we thought about the government and the people.
We have a long way to go, but we are on the way.
He'd established an intimate relationship with the American people through the use of the radio. People would gather in their living rooms, in their kitchens, and then the voice would come on, my fellow Americans, my friends, is what he said. And they would feel that he was talking intimately to them. What we can learn mostly is that if you are a leader, you have to connect to the people that you are leading. There's always going to be decisions that were wrongly made, judgments that were bad, but overwhelmingly the judgments he made benefited the American people. Roosevelt's death came as a shock to the American people, partly because it was the only president many of them had ever known, partly because they hadn't known the depths of his illness, so they weren't prepared for it, but mostly because they had felt a real closeness to him. Isn't it an incredible thing that one man dies and 130 million people feel lonely?